We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And the president was sworn in this week, and one of his main campaign promises was to engage in, as he referred to it, mass deportations. That doesn't involve just sort of pushing people across a land border. You have to hold on to people. You have to have somewhere to put them, to detain them, while the paperwork goes through, at least the paperwork for returning them to their home countries, because you need travel documents and what have you. And so an important part of the new administration's effort to restore order to the immigration system is detention. The capacity to hold people, how all that's done, why that's important is something I wanted to talk about this week. And we have in the studio Andrew Arthur is how you'll know him if you follow his voluminous writings at the center's site at cis.org. And so I thought it would be good to talk about what is detention, how does that work? Usually the illegal immigrants are not being held on criminal charges, but on civil charges. And, sort of what's the mechanics of it. So Art, thanks for coming in. And if you could just start by telling us, what is immigration detention? It's not prison in the sense you're not sentenced to it. But so what's the difference? Why do we need it, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a very important point. In fact, in the 1890s, the Supreme Court specifically stated that detention for immigration purposes isn't a punishment. It's not, meant to take away your liberty for anything other than to ensure that you were available for additional immigration processing and, if necessary, deportation from the United States. And immigration detention actually has a history that stretches back to the original immigration laws of the 1890s. In fact, in 1903, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1903, and amongst the things that it did was it mandated that individuals who arrive at a port of entry in the United States must be detained if they are, inadmissible to this country. If anybody's ever seen Godfather 2, it begins with young Vito Andolini leaving Italy, coming to Ellis Island and being detained. That right. was, one of the aspects of that Immigration Act of 1903. And Congress has steadily expanded immigration detention. It was always available for individuals who were deportable from the United States, folks who were here, who were discovered in the United States, not at the ports, not at the border. But it was really in 1996 that Congress began to put a few key detention provisions, mandatory detention provisions, into the act. They expanded that port detention mandate from 1903 to individuals who were apprehended entering the United States illegally.
Okay.
And in 1996, Congress was concerned about criminal aliens, and so it mandated the detention of aliens who were inadmissible on any criminal ground, and most aliens who were deportable from the United States on criminal grounds as well.
So the Immigration Service could always have detained any of these people. You're talking here about detention mandates.
Detention mandates,
right.
Yes. Because, and it's an important point in this conversation, because if an individual is detained but isn't subject to mandatory detention, that individual can go to an immigration judge, person like me, and ask to be released from or like I was,
right.
and ask to be released from the United States. And at that point, there are really only two main considerations for the court. The one is whether the alien is a flight risk. The other issue is whether the alien poses a threat to the community, either because they're a criminal and they're going to engage in other criminal acts, or that they pose a national security danger to the United States.
Right.
And again, if the judge grants it, the individual can be released. And a lot of those people just never showed up again. And there was a big concern that immigration judges were more liberally releasing individuals who had been stopped at the border and individuals who were criminal aliens who went out to commit other criminal acts.
So Congress basically imposed these mandates because too many immigration judges had basically shown that their judgment wasn't sound, that they were releasing people too frequently who should have been detained.
Congress respectfully disagreed with their determinations,
Right.
Probably the best way to put it. And the third form of mandatory detention is for aliens who have been ordered removed. It's important to understand this is one of those requirements that's honored in the breach when it's honored at all. Congress has mandated that every person ordered removed be detained and be removed physically from the United States within 90 days. Now, right now, we have more than 1.4 million people on ICE enforcement and removal operations, non-detained docket who are under final orders of removal. So, those are 1.4 million people who should have been subject to mandatory detention, but they weren't.
And they're basically, would it be fair to call them fugitives, or did ICE just not even bother to look for them? In other words, did they flee from the possibility of detention, or was there no real prospect of their being detained after they were ordered deported anyway? You see what I mean?
Yes, most of those people aren't fugitives in the sense that,
They're on the lam.
They were on the lam.
Right.
ICE knows where the vast majority of those individuals are. It just hasn't gotten around to removing them from the United States. And this has been a particular issue under the Biden-Harris administration, or was an issue under the Biden-Harris administration. We've spoken in the past about the Biden-Harris administration's liberal use of its prosecutorial discretion, its discretion to investigate aliens, to arrest them, to detain them, especially to prosecute them. They've actually tanked 700,000 perfectly good removal cases. But that extends as well to removal. Mm-hmm. The ultimate sanction for a violation of the immigration laws, of course, is removal. But if you didn't fit within one of the Biden-Harris administration's priorities, if you weren't a very serious criminal, then you weren't going to be removed from the United States. Really, the immigration court process was little more than kabuki theater, where, everybody acted their parts and then went home and went on to live their lives exactly the same way they had.
Unbelievable. So the thing is, though, that if you're in detention, the odds that you're going to be removed when you're ordered removed is obviously, almost by definition, dramatically higher, got to be close to 100%. You were a judge in a detention facility, right? And so none of your people went missing, did they?
No, everybody who was supposed to show up for court, and we're talking about 20,000 individual alien respondents, showed up whether they wanted to or not. But a recent GAO report that was released in December 2024 reveals that 34% of non-detained aliens failed to appear in court. So almost 1 in 3 people who were supposed to show up in court either didn't show up at the first hearing, the second one, or the last one. They just failed to appear. And of course, if you're going to be ordered removed, or you apply for asylum so you can be released into the United States, but have no intention to actually seek asylum, you're not going to bother showing up for court. And you're going to, take the risk that at some point, an administration like the current one, the new Trump administration, is going to decide that you, in fact, should leave the country.
Right. Interesting. So I'm glad you talked about the new administration, and obviously Tom Homan is the border czar, or the immigration czar, whatever his business card says. And he's going to be, rounding up a lot more people because they're going to be working with more of the cooperative jurisdictions to, that will hand over criminals who are arrested on regular local or state crimes. In other words, they'll be cooperating more with ICE. Presumably, they're going to go looking for some people. They have fugitive operations teams that go and track people down. It's labor intensive, but I guess like high value people, they would do that too. And if they do worksite enforcement as on some significant level, as they've said they are going to do, again, they're going to find a lot of illegal aliens. Where are they going to So they're going to detain them. Where are they going to put them all?
That's an excellent question. And this is probably one of the, most poorly understand, or at least most poorly argued parts of any mass deportation scheme. ICE actually does run a number of its own detention facilities in the United States. But it's also common for ICE to contract that out. And they contract it out primarily to two different entities. One of those entities are companies that run private detention. They'll run them for, criminal detainees. They'll also run them for immigration detainees.
Geo Group, I think, is one of them.
Yeah, Geo Group is, probably the one that's going to be most familiar to people. And in a lot of Democratic-dominated states, one of the things that the governments in those states attempt to do is to shut down private, detention.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually a cost savings for the United States, because if ICE runs its own detention facility, everybody who works there is a government employee. They get the same lavish retirement benefits that I enjoy.
And can't be fired.
Whereas if you contract that out to a private organization, you're basically just paying a company to go and hire its own people. Maybe they'll have pensions, maybe they won't. But more likely than not, the United States government isn't going to be on the hook to pay for those people, for the rest of their lives and provide them health insurance and things like that. The things that I, again, as a federal government retiree, get to take advantage of.
And it's more flexible, too, in the sense that you can scale up and scale down depending on what your needs are, right?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I expect to see in a mass deportation scheme is a lot of people leave the United States voluntarily, but you're going to have to ramp up detention very early in that process. Now, again, I said groups like GEO are one of the, private options that you have for detaining people. The other private option is state prisons and county jails. In fact, when I was an immigration judge, my courtroom sat like a carbuncle on the edge of the York County prison. It had been sort of erected, just on the periphery of the prison. I had my courtroom, I had my chambers there, my staff had, their offices there. And this is actually a big bonus for both the federal government and for state and local officials, because a lot of county jails, have excess capacity. Right. They have extra beds. They never know how many people they're going to, need beds for.
Not to be too trivial about it, but like an Andy Griffith show, Otis the drunk was always in a cell, but the other cells were all empty.
Exactly. When Otis was on the water wagon, his cell wasn't going to be used.
Yep.
And so the counties can then lease that space to the federal government. They will provide medical care. They will provide housing. They will provide food for a fixed fee. And that fixed fee is generally pretty reasonable. It's often $150 or less, depending on the locality. When you talk about scalability, that's the ultimate in scalability. Because, if we need 20 beds and a county prison's got 20 beds, well, win-win for everybody.
It's good for them, too, because it's basically free money in a sense.
Free money,
they've already invested
absolutely.
In the facility. Right.
Yeah, because it's a sunk cost for them otherwise, and they can recoup some of that. In fact, in York County, this was a pretty lucrative operation that they ran, and there were other county prisons.
There was actually, just to interject here, I went to an ICE facility in Alabama, which was a county jail, and then they had like half of it or something was the ICE facility. And the interesting thing, I remember asking the warden or whatever his title was, do you start out like new staff in the ICE portion and then move them up to the county jail once they have a little more experience? He said, no, it's totally the other way around, because the standards for the ICE detention facility are so much higher that it actually raises kind of basically the quality of the work in the whole facility. And only the guards who are basically, more reliable or what have you are the ones that they put there. So it was an interesting thing that it actually serves as a kind of a way to increase the sort of the quality level, even of local law enforcement and local jail facilities.
Yeah, that's an absolutely crucial point. In fact, I was and still am friends with many of the correctional officers who worked the immigration side of the facility. And one of the things that they were told was, these aren't criminals. These are immigration detainees. Some may be criminals,
Right.
but by and large, they're immigration detainees, and, you treat them appropriately. We have this facility so they can't leave, but, you need to safeguard.
They're not drug dealing dirtbags and what have you.
Exactly,
Right. Yeah.
exactly. And, one of the ways that the Biden-Harris administration spiked the guns for any future administration was they put more and more onerous requirements on these county jails. And basically, it became too big a hassle for the county jails to continue these agreements.
One of those things I think was like repeated audits and visits too was one of them.
Exactly.
Which you need some of that, but apparently it was pretextual as a way to make it as unappealing as possible to have those arrangements with ICE.
Oversight is absolutely crucial. Needless paperwork is a way to kill somebody by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yep.
So, and, they also, were attempting to shut down a rather large facility, more than 1,000 beds in Adelanto, California. Last I checked, Adelanto was still, stumbling along, but, they had a handful of aliens in a facility that, again, could house more than 1,000 people.
Although some of that is a holdover from COVID, right? They had to sort of have less density, as it were, fewer people in the facility, more beds between them or what have you.
Yeah, so you have a lot of federal judges who just don't have the stomach for immigration detention. And again, I'm not saying that they're not good jurists or that they made a decision one way or the other, but, if I were to look at some of the decisions that they made, it probably had more to do with the nature of the people who were being detained than it did to do with the hygiene and health and safety standards that were under consideration. But again, I'm not going to get into individual cases, but COVID's been over for a long time, and yet many of those restrictions remain.
Right. So one of the problems they're going to face, and this relates directly to detention, is that a lot of the people they want to arrest are, in fact, drug dealing dirtbags and killers and what have you, and gang members, especially this Tren de Aragua prison gang from Venezuela. And from a number of countries, Venezuela especially, it's going to be hard to return those people. They can't detain them indefinitely, can they?
No, unfortunately, they can't. In the early 2000s, the Supreme Court issued a decision that said, amongst other things, that when removal from the United States, doesn't appear likely, then you have to release those individuals. Now, there are some very, very, very serious criminals that are, subject to long-term detention. But by and large, most of those folks end up getting pushed out the door in 6 months or less. It's a 6-month standard for reasonable possibility that they're going to be removed.
To be clear, if they committed a crime and were prosecuted and sentenced, they serve their jail time. This is the immigration detention part of it specifically.
Yeah, and when you're talking about criminal aliens who are serving state or federal time, we actually have a program to do their removal hearings while they're in detention. Again, when I was an immigration judge, I had jurisdiction over 2 federal correctional institutions, FCI Allenwood and FCI Moshannon, as well as every prison in the Pennsylvania state system.
Isn't Allenwood one of the sort of resort jails that nonviolent
used to be,
people
not
go to?
anymore.
Not anymore.
Yeah,
Okay.
so if you're thinking about committing a federal crime so that you can go to Allenwood, pass on it and, reform yourself. And, while people were in those facilities, we could get their cases done. I could hear their asylum claims, grant or deny them, so that when the day came that they were released, most of them were
handed over to ICE. Basically.
Handed over to ICE and removed from the United States directly.
Interesting. And they did like the travel documents and everything, had everything lined up.
Everything
so
was
that
done.
They get their belt in their shoes and be handed over to ICE, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, it was interesting because, some of those people, a lot of drug dealers are in the federal correctional institution system. And, a lot of them wanted to, apply for asylum or withholding of removal, which is like asylum. If you've been convicted of an aggravated felony, you can't get asylum. Or, claimed that they'd be tortured if returned. Right. And, they would, generally fight those cases pretty hard because, when their time was up, they wanted to stay in the United States.
Right.
But there was also an interesting cohort of people who, were drug dealers. They had done their time. They didn't snitch on anybody. And they were perfectly happy to go back home when the time came. And I'd be like, don't you want to apply for, some sort? No, it's fine. I'll be fine.
Interesting. Okay. And
So-
I'll sneak back later. So,
Exactly.
Right. Interesting. So one thing that often, people always think of when you're talking about detaining people is Guantanamo Bay. And we've used it in the past, and I don't even know what sort of category it'd fall under, but during the 30 years ago, during the Cuban and Haitian rafter crisis, a bunch of illegals taking to boats and what have you, a lot of them were kept in Gitmo and then processed there. Is that an option for Homan with these gang members, or even in Gitmo, do they have to let them go after 6 months?
Yeah, so the primary category of person that we hold at Guantanamo Bay today are Khalid Sheikh Mohammed,
Right, sure.
mastermind of 9/11 and his ilk.
But it's a big place. It's the size of Rhode Island or something. So, there's room for immigration detention facilities.
The
too.
legality of removing a person from the continental United States so that you can detain them abroad is extremely tricky.
I see.
So
Okay.
if you catch somebody in the United States, the idea is that you have to keep them in the United States until the time comes. But you bring up a very interesting point. Thanks to the base realignment and closure movement, or BRAC,
Right.
we have a lot of federal military facilities that are sitting empty. And again, those places have barracks, they have dining halls, they have medical bays, they have everything you want. All you need to do is to move people to those places and use them.
Right.
And one of the things that the Obama administration in particular did was that it would place, families and unaccompanied children that it couldn't get into the HHS system. In the case of the unaccompanied children, it would put them on military bases temporarily. Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma, Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, near San Antonio, and Naval Station Ventura County in California were three places that the Obama administration used for that. And Donald Trump had teased doing something similar the first time he was president. And of course, there was a big kerfluffle about that. But, given the sentiments that I've seen, and I, last week testified before the Senate, a lot of members of Congress, no longer have the same repulsion toward certain immigration enforcement policies that they evidenced in the past. So, that's definitely an option. But I think what you're going to see is an expansion of, that private detention facility space and those county prisons, in addition to the space that ICE has available to it.
Right.
Military bases would probably be a last resort.
And when the president talks about using the military for immigration enforcement, isn't one of the sort of most significant ways that would be done would be housing people on military facilities?
Yeah, when you say the most significant, it is. But, it's often a last option. When you talk about using the military, you really talk about using them to do things like build infrastructure at the border, to provide logistical help to Border Patrol agents,
Right.
transportation and things like that. But detention is an option. It's an option that's been used by other administrations, and it's an option that could be used by this administration.
This isn't detention, but what about removing people on military aircraft? Is that an issue? I don't know how. ICE charters flights, but can they put them on, load them all up into a C-130 and take them to wherever they're going?
Sure, if you've got enough to justify it, it's certainly one of those things that can be done. The president would issue a proclamation or an executive order that would ask the Department of Defense to help out DHS, and one of the ways that they could do it would be that. But, this gets into another area that you often hear demagogued a lot. Oh, ICE doesn't have enough aircraft to move people. Well, I got news for you. Every major city has an international airport.
Right.
And, I've been doing this for 30 some years. And most of the people that, we removed from the United States when I was at ICE, and most of the removals that I oversaw when I was, working for Congress, we're simply taking somebody to an airplane, waiting with them at the departure gate, put them on the plane, wheels up,
Commercial flight.
depart foreign, and moving them out that way.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, that is the kind of thing that would work only with non-problematic people, right? I mean, United Airlines, they're not going to take somebody who's likely to, make a fuss, right?
Yeah. And again, there are safeguards that you can put into place even to fly somebody out on a domestic airliner. You can have escort for that individual.
Right. Okay.
So you're basically buying 3 seats instead of 1. But yeah, most people, when the time comes, when they know they're going to be removed, they accept their fate and,
Right.
decide that they're going to start their new lives. Now, there are plenty of people who act up on airliners, and they're not all aliens.
Yeah, right. Yeah. People who are overserved with the, absolutely.
People who are overserved or didn't receive proper discipline when they were children to know how to act in public.
So back to detention specifically, one thing we've seen over the past 4 years is people crossing the border illegally, but then they flag down the Border Patrol, turn themselves in. The point being they're going to be released when in fact they were supposed to be detained. How can the Border Patrol deal with that in the future? Because if you've got, 1,000 people a day, in one border sector coming across, that's not what we're seeing now. It's down. Where do you put them? How do you deal with that rather than just letting them go, which is what the Biden people did for 4 years?
One of the things that the Biden administration did was that it expanded the number of Border Patrol processing centers, soft-sided processing centers. If anybody ever goes on any of our border tours, sometimes you get to see one.
It's like a tent facility, but more substantial.
More substantial. It's
Right.
a temporary building. And, individuals can be detained in those facilities for a couple of days. It's important to note the fact, when we talk about detention, we're talking about ICE detention. That Border Patrol processing time doesn't really,
I see.
It's not really the same thing. And you want to get people out of Border Patrol processing and into an ICE detention facility as quickly as possible. But yeah, if we have large numbers of people at the border, they go into the processing facility, they're detained until ICE can pick them up, and then they can be sent anywhere. Again, when I was an immigration judge in York, Pennsylvania, we share the Mason-Dixon line with Maryland, but it's not exactly a border state. People would be flown into Harrisburg or BWI and bust the facility, and that's where they'd be. And I'd hear border cases for people from all around the world.
Interesting.
It's not ideal to do it that way, and it's, probably more cost effective for the Trump administration to simply expand the processing that CBP has, switch it over to ICE processing, provide appropriate facilities for them to hold people in. And then you could do the whole thing there. You can have the court there, you can have the detention there, and it can all be done.
And now you testified last week on Remain in Mexico, which is not really a detention program, but in a sense, it kind of is a detention program. It's sort of like free detention in Mexico instead of, being actually locked in a building in the United States. So how good an option and what are the pluses and minuses of doing it that way?
Remain in Mexico is extremely effective. Very briefly, and I encourage anybody to watch my 2.5 hours of testimony, but I'll synopsize.
Well, your 5-minute statement is online too, if you just want to watch that. Online at CIS.org.
But yeah, going back to 2019, the Trump administration, DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, were faced with a huge problem. About half the people who were showing up at the border were from Central America, and they were families. They were adults traveling with children. Now, under a poorly reasoned 2015 court decision, DHS can't hold children for more than 20 days, and they generally release the parents along with the kid because it's not like you turn the kid out on the street. But Remain in Mexico enabled the first Trump administration to utilize an authority in the immigration law to send people back across the border to await the removal hearing if they'd crossed that border when they came in. And after it was implemented, when it was fully implemented, it went through a phased-in implementation and there were court challenges. But we saw the number of families drop by about 80%. We saw overall apprehensions decline. It was very effective because people thought, if I bring a kid to the United States, I'm going to be quickly released. I'm going to be able to live in the country. It's going to take years for my asylum case to be heard. That wasn't true under Remain in Mexico. Now, the big downside of remain in Mexico was the fact that there were allegations that people who had been sent back to Mexico to await their hearings generally, remained in border towns. And border towns are, probably the most dangerous part of Mexico. A couple of years back, I wrote a piece that said, we don't have to do that detention in border towns. Pay the Mexican government money to keep them someplace else. I suggested Monterrey. And again, when you talk about, and truly it is kind of a counterpart to detention, because the whole idea of detention is you're going to be where we want you, when we want you, and you're not going to, exploit the asylum system just to live here because you're in detention. You can't work. And the same two things are true of remain in Mexico. So yeah, if it's a question of money, it's actually cheaper to pay the Mexican government to provide for those individuals on the other side of the border, rather than even to detain them at county jails in the United States. Show up at port courts, they have their hearings. If they get granted asylum, they go out one door. And if their asylum is denied, they go out the other door to Mexico.
Interesting. And the last sort of broad question I want to ask is, there's a huge backlog in asylum applications. Those people are mostly not being detained. Is there any sense to actually looking for people who are in asylum proceedings to get them into detention? In other words, to sort of go back and dig into the backlog and detain those people, or not? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is, especially for asylum applicants who are at large in the United States who have criminal histories. Going back to the Biden-Harris priority memo of September 2021, there are individuals who are subject to detention who weren't detained. In fact, the state of Texas and Louisiana sued the Biden administration in a case called Texas versus United States, saying the law says you're supposed to be detaining these people and you're not. And, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled they couldn't force the administration to detain any given alien. And for that reason, they couldn't force the administration to detain every alien.
Right. So they lost the lawsuit, but still the law requires those people to be detained.
Yeah, because, there are, a lot of asylum applicants who have crimes, and some of those crimes are very serious. They should have been detained in the interest of the public good. One of the things that you always hear is, most aliens in the United States are, more law-abiding than the average native of the United States. Whether that's true or not, it's impossible to determine. Anybody that tells you that, is basically selling you a bill of goods, because nobody knows the truth. But the, critical point is that criminal aliens are criminals and should be detained.
Right.
So if this isn't that big a problem, great, then we won't need that much detention and it's not going to be that much enforcement. But for those people, plainly, they should be detained. But you bring up an important point there. When it comes to detention, one of the things that's true is asylum claims move a whole lot quicker in detention than they do outside of detention. When I left the bench in 2015, the median detention time for an alien, which is, sort of a rough estimate of how long it takes for their asylum claims to be heard, was less than 40 days compared to, 1,031 days, which is what it was in 2022, or 846 days, which,
they had no
for a
incentive,
non-detained case.
They had no incentive to drag it out. If they're out on the street, they want to drag it out as long as possible.
Yeah,
if
people
they're
in detention.
Yeah, they want to get out one way or the other, either get their asylum or even get sent home, but not stay in detention.
Yeah, no, a lot of the nonsense that you see in non-detained immigration court just doesn't happen in immigration court. Again, when I say nonsense, I'm talking about dilatory, tactics. There are plenty of, continuances, both in custody and out of custody, that are perfectly valid. But when it comes to lawyers playing games, and the Supreme Court made clear all the way back in the 80s, when it comes to immigration enforcement, it is in the best interest of aliens to drag it out as long as possible. Sure. That they've considered a series of motion to reopen cases because people would, be ordered removed, removal would be imminent, and then they'd move to reopen so that they could stay. And the Supreme Court had to crack down on that and just made clear, if you're in detention, you generally want it over as quick as possible. If you're not in detention, you want it to last as long as it can.
Right. All the more reason to maximize detention if necessary. And in fact, the campaign against detention of anybody for any reason, any immigration reason, is one of the core goals of the anti-borders activists. That's why they want to shut down so-called private prisons and keep counties from renting out facilities. I mean, because the point is, as you pointed out, if illegal immigrants aren't detained, they're much more likely to be able to stay, either by dragging out cases or just by disappearing and going on the lam. So,
yeah, I mean, one of the things that argument always misses is in this continental republic of ours, there's always going to be a state that's going to detain you. So, when I lived in Maryland, I testified before the Maryland legislature when they wanted to ban all ICE detention in Maryland. And the argument, one of the best arguments that I made to them, they were all good, but this was one of the best, was, if you don't detain them in Maryland, that doesn't mean they're not going to be detained. They're probably going to be sent to Louisiana or Georgia or Wyoming or, some other place where they're going to be far away from their families and far away from their lawyers.
Right.
And that actually redounded with the Maryland legislature. They didn't move it. Then once I left the state, they moved the bill banning these facilities. And, now you can read articles about how people have been sent so far away from home because of their detention.
Thanks to the Maryland legislature. Yep. Okay, well, good. Thank you, Art. These are important issues. People don't really think about it. They hear the talk about mass deportation, et cetera. And, that's all good, but it's not like you snap your fingers and it just happens. There's a lot of work involved in kind of the plumbing and the process, and detention is one of the key issues. And I think it's important to understand. So thanks for coming in, and we will obviously have you back as more things happen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Art and I talked about the important issue of detention, which obviously is going to figure in a prominent way in the new administration's calculations and what they're going to do going forward. They've already started significant arrests of criminal aliens, and Tom Homan, the newly installed border czar, has said publicly there's going to be a real return of worksite enforcement, and so that will yield probably even a larger number of illegal aliens, fewer of them criminals, but more regular illegal aliens that will have to be detained. The president, on his first day, issued an executive order ending catch and release, so people coming across the border and uttering the magic words of asylum are no longer just going to be let go. So to keep up with the flurry of activity in this first week, and going forward, obviously, but in this first week of the new administration, take a look at our website at cis.org. We have blog posts on a number of the issues that have already happened, some of the non-executive order issues, but also executive orders about the invasion proclamation. In other words, the president proclaimed an invasion at the southern border and declared an emergency. We have a blog post on the Alien Enemies Act. We've got some op-eds on a variety of issues too. So to keep up, I mean, it's hard even for us to keep up, obviously, but we've digested some of the activity that's been going on with regard to immigration in this first week of the new administration. So I definitely would recommend you check out the website and the blog specifically, cis.org. And we will be writing about more of the executive orders and other actions that the administration is taking right up front in a big way over the next week or two. Because the president has said, right after he was sworn in, he said he considered immigration to be even more important than inflation in his victory in November. So they clearly understand the importance of this issue, not just in a policy sense, but in a political sense. And we will be obviously following it and reporting on it as it happens. So that's it for this week of Parsing Immigration Policy. Thank you all to you for listening. Thanks to our producer, Brian Griffith, for making this possible. And as always, if you have any questions, compliments, what have you, just email us at center@cis.org. And just a last note, I don't usually sort of rattle the cup in these events, but this is free to listen to, but it's not free to do. So for those of you who have the ability to throw us a little of your loose change, go to cis.org/donate, and there's a variety of ways you can help support the center, this podcast, of course, but all of our work in general. So that's it for this week, and I hope you will tune in next week.